Chris!
I made some bold assumptions about Battlebit Remastered from a video talking about problematic indie game behaviors among fans and devs, and it was brought up that while this drop-off I was discussing was pretty high, that should be expected for most online games. I was curious as well to see what the expected rate should look like myself, and with the help of Steam charts I was able to compile a survey of 6 months worth of average users from release to within a surge of popularity. I'll get into details of what was submitted, but I wanted to discuss the objective of this survey and a hypothesis I had before I get the results in. The objective of the survey is to gather a list of online multiplayer games that are easily dividable by 3, which in this case was 75 to 25 games a section, so I could determine the true average among all games and averages for top performers, expected performance, and the underperformance, and compare that with Battlebit Remastered, which is separated from the survey. The survey chose 6 months because, well, Battlebit was 6 months old at the time I made the survey, so I didn't have any new data. Now, hindsight is 20/20, but I acquired this data by hand as opposed to just pulling it directly from whatever API Steam Charts uses to get that information. The survey I have is fine enough for the purposes of this experiment, but if I wanted to expand the data, then I'd need to redo the whole project if I wanted to know that info. But I don't mind, since a lot of the time Steam Charts looks to give out a lot of discrepancies with the data, such as the beginning month being at a time where not a lot of people played it yet, so the average is skewed to make the last month look a lot more impressive than it actually was, which isn't the point of this survey. But anyway, my hypothesis is that the user retention of a video game cannot single-handedly determine the quality to the point we can determine if a game is good or not by metrics alone. But we can determine if a game is abnormally performing by dropping below its expectations that it can be considered at a tier lower than its initial expected metric by historical analysis. As to why it's abnormal will be up to whatever we discover about these games. So, to start, I indiscriminately added whatever I could find on Steam that natively launched on the platform and had at least a 6-month release window. I specifically chose this because I wanted to attempt to accurately determine this, and bloating the information with re-releases of the latest Call of Duty was gonna obviously change the metrics. However, a couple games like Modern Warfare 2 were a native launch on Steam, but were transferred to the god-awful Call of Duty hub launcher, which makes room to say that it was kind of not a fair comparison because there's technically 2 games in there. But as I was editing this, I kind of realized I kind of put it in there anyway. So we might as well point out that there are going to be discrepancies with the data, and anything that doesn't reflect whatever you try to look up on Steam charts will be clarified on the sheet, such as I don't want to bother finding out if this is actually a native launch or not, but it's a good enough chart for what we are trying to answer. To determine the user fall-off rate over time, we need to compare the difference in percent between the month being checked on and the very first month, leaving 5 columns of data overall to sample. After that's all compared, we then need to gather 3 chunks of the results to get a more accurate reading of the averages for what is good, okay, and bad for the game's user retention, instead of just the average in total. So after getting all this data and getting the averages over 5 months, I developed this chart to visualize the expected performance of a game for each tier of expectations. The exceptional performers look like they tend to not just go beyond reaching more users per month than the initial one, but they also tend to end up with the last month being a peak of their user base within this scope. This could be because half the samples were overachievers, but this list of 25 within the averages did have games that reached below or around the averages we are about to talk about, which probably explains why the average line has a larger gap between the other two. But anyway, the average for the sample showed that a usual performance expectation is that your game will iteratively drop by 25% for 2 months, and then become a lot more stable after the 50% line on the 3rd month of release, and an underperforming game usually drops off really fast after the 1st month, but tends to be a lot more stable in its drop-off as opposed to the others in this comparison. So with this information, how does Battlebit Remastered compare to these averages? Comparing averages, the game initially reaches a pretty decent 96% user retention, until it exponentially drops by 82% of its user base within the 4th month, dropping both exceptional and average to below expectations. So it seems like I did have some form of basis to make this statement that Battlebit was unexpectedly performing below well what it should have done. It definitely didn't do as terribly as Battlefield 2042 in terms of retention, but it's still pretty unexpected to be that low considering that people were hyping this game up for months after release, with video essays about how this was a better Battlefield. It should be noted that while I was compiling this information, I found that user numbers don't determine if a game is good or not either, and that could be entirely up to the circumstances we can't prove on metrics alone. For example, a couple outstanding examples are Guns of Icarus and Town of Salem, which were overperforming, but their metrics consisted of a couple hundred users. So since we have a lot of metrics, can we accurately determine a game's quality on how it did within 6 months? And for the most part, yes, but just because it's in there doesn't mean that it's a bad game, because while Battlefield and Halo Infinite were in there also was Grand Theft Auto 5 and Guilty Gear Strive. Those games certainly aren't terrible, and we have the power of foresight to determine the quality just by playing them. Come on! And I definitely played those two, and they are nowhere near a bad game, so while an objectively bad game is in the underperformers by association, it does not determine the quality of the end product by metrics alone. So in conclusion, user retention cannot accurately determine the quality of a game due to circumstances that can't be identified by a metric, but we were able to successfully determine that Battlebit Remastered was unexpectedly performing worse than it should have, but we can't actually answer why from this information, so my assumption for why it did this doesn't have a foundation, which was that it was a fad game that couldn't keep up with the expectations that it was given. That's all I was going to talk about for this, but before I close this with a dumbass meme, I included the link to that chart and also a script I was going to use for another video, but I chose not to work on it because I just didn't feel like making a video about it, but I also put too much effort into it to throw it away, so I put it here if you want to read. That's pretty much what I all wanted to talk about, so bye.